Well, I think we should probably start. Y'all are so far away, but I don't want to leave the fire. So, let me tell you a little bit about myself personally, and then we can go from there. Okay? So, where do I begin? I went to undergrad at Lafayette College for engineering. And about 3/4 of the way through my engineering degree, I took a class called Engineering Design 1. And the very beginning of the class, the professor said, you will learn about springs, nuts, bolts, screws, and nails. You will learn how to design these things. And it was the worst class ever. Grueling, and every scenario, he said, if you get this wrong, the bridge falls. And I said, well, that's some pressure. And it was a terrible class. And we get to the very end of the class, and at which point I've decided I really like the theory of engineering. I like how it explains things I see, but this was not what I want. And he said, this is what you'll do for 90% of your time as an engineer. And even worse, you'll do so referencing tables that have already done the work for you. So, and I said, well, I'm out. That's it. At the same time, I was doing I was the president of the Christian Fellowship, doing lots of things with them. And I thought, well, I'd like to do that more when I finished. I like that. I don't like that staying up till 3 a.m. doing problem sets. And so, yeah, so I went to seminary right out of college. And while I was in seminary, I caught the academic bug. And after finishing seminary, I was the interim priest, rector of a place for a year. And then I went off to Durham, England, where I did my PhD studying with Francis Watson, who you do not know, but that's fine. He's kind of a scholar. He doesn't write popular books, but he's the kind of people who do write popular level books reference, kind of thing. He's very weird, but very kind. And then I left the doctoral program. Completed it. Sorry, that's the right word. So my PhD was in, how do I describe it? I studied parables, comparing the Gospel of Thomas with the Synoptic Gospels. And the idea of it was, if you take a parable and place it within a narrative, what does what does that say about narrative? Versus the same parable placed it within a sayings collection. What does that say about a sayings collection? And so it ended up being fairly kind of pseudo-scientific in that way. You have a kind of different mediums and the same reagent within the two mediums. And so it was a kind of hermeneutical study doing that, and sort of, which then allowed me to compare Hans Fry, who taught at New Haven 40 years ago, who talks a lot about narrative, and Rudolf Bultmann, who was a German form critic in the first half of the 20th century. So the whole spiel is sayings versus narrative. What does narrative do? What do sayings do?
What is sayings?
Sorry?
What is sayings?
So the Gospel of Thomas is a list of Jesus' teachings. It begins with, these are the words that Jesus spoke and Judas, Thomas, Didymus wrote down. And Jesus said, blank. Jesus said, blank. Jesus said. Jesus said. There's 114 of them. And they all go, Jesus said, whoever is near me is near the fire. Sorry, that's one of the weird ones. Jesus said, there was a fisherman, and he cast his net into the sea, and he pulled out a great fish. So.
Amy Jo Levine uses that as a reference a lot, and she's doing the commentaries on the Gospel. She refers back to Thomas. when I first saw it, I'm like going, huh? Who's that?
Yeah.
Realizing, and
Yeah.
then realizing, oh, there are other narratives
Yeah.
that make it in the big book.
So Thomas. I mean, I could talk about Thomas all day. You tell me when to stop.
Time for your 10:30.
Yeah, that's all right. I mean, everyone has lots of opinions about Thomas because we have Greek fragments that come from the 2nd century. We have 3 of them, and which is more than we have for a lot of texts. And so there's this kind of debate about how early is Thomas, how late is Thomas. Is Thomas dependent upon the synoptics? In other words, is Thomas reading the synoptics and writing down his gospel? Where do you date Thomas of its composition? When was it written? Was it written in 50? Was it written in 150? And it serves, because of that ambiguity within the kind of scholarly context, it's kind of a wax nose. People can use it however they see fit. Thomas can become a witness to Gnostic 2nd and 3rd century Christianity. For others, Thomas is a witness to early Jewish Christianity. And those two have nothing to do with one another. And so my external examiner is a guy by the name of Simon Gathercole. And afterwards, he would joke with me. He said, "We are one of 5 sane Gospel of Thomas scholars." Yeah. So, but you guys didn't hear about the Gospel of Thomas in a sermon, nor is it read in Christian worship for good reason. So, but.
So where do we find this book? Where do we see the list? Is it on the internet?
It's on the internet. The best translation is by a guy by the name of Thomas Lambden.
Andy with the first name. Sorry, bad joke. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but it's on the internet. I mean, some people hail it as like the 5th gospel, and that's a little exalted.
Do the
Yeah.
Catholics use it?
No,
Oh, Anglicans do.
no
Who
one uses it.
What are we doing with it?
We didn't know it existed until it was found in clay jars in Egypt.
Clay jars in Egypt?
Clay jars.
In Egypt?
Yeah, we knew it existed, but we didn't know what was in it. Put it that way. Everyone who cites it in the first 5 centuries of Christianity says this text is crazy. This is not something we read. And then we find it in Egypt, and you know, people like me have to write PhD theses, and so we're gonna write about it. So. Yeah.
So does this gospel vary differently from the accounts
At parts.
in parts?
Yeah. Yeah. In some parts, it's really weird. So at the very end, Peter asks Jesus, "What will become of Mary?" And Jesus says, "Don't worry about her." Now, there's all kinds of evocations of the ending of John's gospel, right? Where what will become of the beloved disciple, and Jesus says, "Don't worry about Mary because she'll become male, and thus she will be saved."
Yeah.
So that's one kind of on the extreme end. The other is you get parables that are very similar, that with just some slight modifications. You have the parable of the sower, and it talks about how worm will eat the seed, which is like little modifications. So some bits are quite normal. I mean, I think the general gist of Thomas is that the way to life is to deny the world, and you live outside of the world, and you'll find life, because the world leads to death, and by living outside of it, you find life.
So it's monastic life.
Yeah. So, who used the Gospel of Thomas is a hotly debated issue. I tend to think that it was used by the local Pachomian monks of Egypt, who were impeccably orthodox, but nevertheless very much on their own. So
Were they in Egypt proper or out on the Sinai?
they were in Lower Egypt.
Lower Egypt?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can we talk about the resurrection for a minute?
Absolutely. Thomas doesn't believe in the resurrection, so I'm happy to pivot.
I appreciated your message very much. It was very stimulating. And I realize on one hand we're saying we don't know, we have no categories to fully understand what will be.
Yeah.
And yet you do have the pictures of the New Jerusalem and all that goes on in Revelation, or restored garden, and so I guess, are we supposed to think about heaven in some way to try and understand, or we just say, we don't know, but we're looking forward to it? I mean, what do we do with these pictures in light of what you just said?
So the pictures we get for heaven are principally from Revelation. And the thing about the pictures that are described in the book of Revelation is they are largely symbolic. And so there is a great deal of, so it talks about trees bearing fruit in multiple seasons. You can possibly imagine the idea of blueberry bushes always producing blueberries. But what's being communicated by that imagery, which would have been understood by the first readers of it, is that there is no off season. It's always the harvest. It's a picture of abundance. So I think the difficulty with Revelation has to do with when people take it as a kind of one-to-one picture of what will be, when John is writing an epistolatory apocalypse. That's a very fancy terminology made up by that Richard Bauckham describes. On the one hand, it's a letter, right? He's writing to very specific churches. So the message is there are messages for each of these churches, and therefore it's meant to be understood by those churches. On the other hand, it's an apocalypse. He says so as much. Apocalypse and revelation are the same word in Greek. The revelation of Jesus Christ. And the thing about apocalyptic texts, of which John is one of several, is they often use symbolic imagery to describe earthly realities. So
in your presentation, when you were talking about the resurrection, you were talking about the cyclical nature of the organic life that we have.
Mm-hmm.
I just started laughing. I had a picture in my mind of, yes, our human bodies are part of that cycle of decay. We nourish the land, we nourish what will be to come, but our spirits and this may be crazy, but when we become born again, or when our spirits are awakened, our spirits are no longer part of that cycle of the human experience. Even though they're connected to the human experience, our spirits don't need to be resurrected. Our spirits, I guess, if we've been made alive in Christ, we are alive in Christ. It's our bodies that are decayed, and this whole thing that's inside of us. So there's almost like, in my mind, you've got this circular life that we're living, and tangentially, our spirits are on our way already. Depending on how much we decide we want to invest in being still and resting in the Lord.
Yeah.
Maybe you go a stretch, but that's kind of where I went when you were going there. I was like, well, how do you do this? How do you take our spiritual life and separate it from the decay and the need for resurrection?
Well, I think Paul's answer is the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
So part of what you're describing a little bit. So our notion of bodies and souls is largely so one vision of heaven is of disembodied souls, and smart people have talked about this throughout church history, but I think Paul, as a Jew, isn't Platonic in that way. He doesn't believe in a pre-existent soul that can exist independently of a body. And so for Paul, if there is a soul, it always must be embodied, right? There is no getting beyond embodied existence. The question is what kind of embodied existence will be. And that's what Paul's writing about. Paul's responding to the idea that there is the resurrection has happened, and we are pure spirits, and there is no bodiliness. And Paul says, no, there is bodiliness, but it's bodiliness of a different kind altogether than the one that you understand or can interact with on a day to day.
So when we're absent from the body and we're with the Lord, what is that? I'm doing the whole thing. I'm doing the debate idea of it. It's like, because if the moment our body takes its last breath, according to our faith, we're with the Lord. Well, we're not with the Lord physically, so there is some separation there, and it's a thought process.
Yeah, so there's lots of biblical data for that on the sort of disembodied souls would be, for example, when Saul consults the witch of Endor and is met by Samuel in this process, or when Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration and there is Moses and Elijah are there with him. But I think so. One sort of solution to that, one sort of way of dealing with that data, is to say there's a pre-existent disembodied souls, and this is who Jesus is communing with. I think a more interesting, likely to me at least, idea is that the Transfiguration is a kind of retrojected vision of heaven that's happening. And so when Paul says I would be the contrast being in the body versus being with the Lord, I think the one theological answer to that is that our notion of linear time does not exist in the resurrection, and that the resurrection is actually outside of time, and therefore all of time is equidistant to the resurrection. In the same way, all of time is equidistant to God. And so if you think in chronological time, then yes, you're sort of, but that's your a priori, which is driving your belief in the disembodied soul. Sorry, you're getting me on like all the things I would not say publicly.
Nate sent me that question to ask you.
Paul talks about being clothed. We don't want to be naked. We don't want to.
Correct.
We're going to be clothed.
2 Corinthians 5. Yep.
So what is that?
So the purpose is to be reclothed. So there's all kinds of baptismal imagery going on with there, and it probably corresponds to baptismal practices, in which there's all kinds of ritual baths around Jerusalem, in which you walk down in one and you walk up and on the other side. And so the hypothesis is that these baths were reappropriated for Christian baptism, so that you would unclothe naked down into the water, death, walk out of the water and be reclothed with different clothes. So when Paul uses that to talk about being unclothed, i.e. away from the body, death, and then being reclothed, given a spiritual body, a different, the resurrection.
So when you talk about time being equidistant.
So be clothed just means resume your old life.
Well,
Well, not exactly, but
I mean, we'll see.
After all, you.
So part of the difficulty, if you have if your concept of the resurrection is a kind of Earth 2.0, what that can lead to is a view. I just watched Gladiator 2. Now, the first Gladiator is quoted in Gladiator 2. Spoiler. What we do here echoes into eternity. This is on the lips of Russell Crowe, who's decidedly not a Christian in that film, right? But that's what he says. What we do in eternity now echoes into eternity. And that is in some ways a kind of eternity as Earth 2.0. Because the greater continuity you draw between this world and the next, the more you are likely to view what comes next as a product of what we do in the here and now. So I know many people who will read a certain New Testament scholars' books about the resurrection, and their end conclusion is that if I was a lawyer in this life, I will be a lawyer in the next life. Because what I do as a lawyer has to do with worth and value and building the kingdom, and therefore that I would continue on to do that in the next life. I don't know if any of you are lawyers, but I hope there are no lawyers in heaven. Not, occupationally.
They've been disbarred.
No need.
They'd have-
There's no need for lawyers.
Right.
There's no
If there's no sin, there's no need.
No
Right.
need for lawyers.
But that works from the negation of a negative, right? That's the logic. If there is no sin, we need no lawyers, and that's how the New Testament thinks about heaven.
Can I come back to the idea of this equidistant in time?
Yeah.
From God's perspective,
Yeah.
it seems linear to us. In this sense, where we get the feeling that somebody dies and then awaits the resurrection. But in God's time, does that mean resurrection happens the minute they die and they're clothed with the new?
That is, probably. I mean, so Paul says we will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. So the question is whether he believes in some sort of sense of what's often called soul sleep, which is the idea that you die and you're not aware of the time between now and the future. And then you wake up instantly at the general resurrection.
Because, well, now you're still in a time signature, and if you're still talking about the kingdom of heaven
Right.
is outside of time.
That's a way.
Doesn't mean anything.
That's a way of like, squaring around peg, with regard to the resurrection, which is eternal. Eternal just means no time. That's has no beginning, has no end. It is eternal. There is no time. So that's heaven, but our experience is chronological, and the redemption is an eruption into the chronological time. So those are that's how you. It's the fun part to think about is.
What I don't want us to lose is the sense that there's a hope, a real hope for something a whole lot better than what we have.
Right.
Having served as a missionary in Japan for years with people from a worldview that, there's some kind of ancestor worship thing going on, that they're floating around or somewhere, some kind of spiritual thing. But the idea of a resurrected body and all that, because it's just not there.
Yep.
I've been to too many Shinto Buddhist funerals where the sense of despair is palatable. At one cremation, we were in this crematory, and there the whole family would gather around the slab from which the remains of the cremated body would come out, and they would have a ceremonial container and with ceremonial chopsticks, and they would pick up the little pieces of bone fragment, put in there, and the message was, this person is gone.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I was with a group of Christians and we were standing around in sorrow, but singing hymns in hope of what was a future life,
Yeah.
And so obviously the resurrection, I guess, is given to us as a solid hope, although technically we can't quite figure it out, but
Yeah.
I'm just glad there is something beyond.
Yeah. The best template, so, I mean, I preached on Paul. The best template for what the resurrection looks like is the resurrected Jesus. And, you know, some of Jesus's appearances are very conventional, and some are weird. Now, we sort of, a good example of that is the Road to Emmaus. Have you ever seen a painting of the Road to Emmaus? They always show Jesus like cloaked, because the text says that he hid himself from them, and that's possible, but it's also possible that he was actually there walking and talking with them, and they didn't recognize him, because or when in John's Gospel, when Jesus appears to the 12 twice, first without Thomas and second time with Thomas, he does so instantly. It's not like he walks into the door, through the door. He just appears. And it's very difficult to think about what that might, like, okay, that A boggles the mind, and B says there's something about the resurrected body which we don't quite know like how it works.
I think it's a meaning to the great cloud of witnesses too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There really is a great cloud of witnesses that's present.
Who are equidistant to us in the here and now. Yeah.
Although
Both
that
past and future.
although that could be just the Old Testament heroes that went before, not necessarily physically acting as witnesses. It could be,
Well, that's
look at
possible,
all that
but-
they did, and in light of their testimony and what they achieved and trusted God
Yes,
for.
it could be used
This
either
is,
way.
this is the witness to us. But it doesn't necessarily mean there's this cloud of people looking down. It could be, I don't know.
Right, well, I was thinking also about the already but not yet sort of nature of the kingdom, and if that's the case, then there could actually be a great cloud of witnesses that's not in our physical realm, but
To go off on another tack, if you've known people that their lives were destroyed by whatever, personal experience, habits, and they come to know the Lord, whether it's through recovery or not, and you meet them years later, you can sit there and say, who are you? Because they are so
Yeah.
different than the person that they were. I don't know, I just was thinking about that when you're thinking about him being cloaked.
Mm-hmm.
And I have met people like that. Probably one of them is that there's such a difference in their life when the Lord came into their life that they are a different person.
Yeah.
They have the same physical appearance, but their countenance is completely different.
Yeah. And that's the part about this sort of the text of today, which I try to bring it back to this at the end of my sermon, which is that the pattern of God's activity being consistent in this way. In other words, when Paul talks about conversion, his own conversion, he talks in terms of death to life language, and that which isn't to say that Paul believed himself to be resurrected in that, but rather the pattern of activity of incongruous immediate kind of change that existed outside of where he was headed, right, is the same of what happens at the resurrection. So the pattern of God's activity is death and resurrection across the board, not just in the future, but in the here and now. And to me, that points to a lot of kind of marvelous things about grace, about how God works in life, what's possible, impossibly possible for everyone. Yeah.
I was just talking to a friend of mine yesterday that was going through a lot of despair, really deep heart despair, and just said to him, this is where the Holy Spirit does his best work.
Yeah.
is that deep interchange. The resurrection of taking the heart of stone and turning it into a heart of flesh.
Yeah. You had a.
Yeah, one quick thought and one question. One, talking about the body. I was watching a show this weekend, it was a conversation, and I think it was Kevin Costner said, well, I'm not the man I used to be. And I chuckled at it, and then I sat there and I thought about it, and I said, wait a minute, to be honest with you, I feel I'm more the man than I've ever been, because it's my beliefs and thoughts that make me the man I am, not the decaying tissue that's part of the body. And the question is, you talk about parables, do you think there is a use for modern parables to talk to the people that we have trouble coming across to today that might be used? Because, you know, when we start talking, you know, Jesus loves you and he died for you, you can see the eyes glaze over. But
Yeah.
a parable makes it so that you kind of have to think of it, oh, I thought of that meaning out of it. It's a little different than being told something.
I think this is your segue into Mockingbird.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
And in a little less than 10 minutes, if you could tell us about that, which will address, Jeff, I believe, what you're talking about.
Yeah. So the language of parables in Jesus' day were readily understood by his hearers. He's using a common worldview framework to subvert it. Most parables have a twist to them at the end. But they're stories, they're narratives, right? And so, to your point, I think the stories and narratives by which we live today are largely pop cultural, partly philosophical, but it's music, it's TV shows, it's movies like Gladiator, where, I think the way you kind of re-enchant a disenchanted world is through the use of pop culture. And so Mockingbird started principally as a theology and pop culture website where someone would, where we were sort of constantly on the listening for resonances of things which pointed toward God's grace. And so, like a good example from an article that went up this week is it was on Bowen Yang. Do you know who Bowen Yang is? He's an SNL cast member. He was in Wicked recently, and he apparently had a dance number that he didn't want to really. He was never a dancer. He's a comedian, not a dancer. And the choreographer said, "Bowen, you are a dancer." And Bowen, and from that moment on, Bowen believed he was a dancer and danced. Now, that's a great example from pop culture of the Abraham story, right? God makes a declaration about Abraham. Abraham believes it to be true, and it's reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, the theological term for that is imputation. But what's going on is God creates something out of nothing through speech. You are forgiven, and it happens. And so that's one example of like how I think a kind of cultural Christian apologetic best works, is not so much to create a kind of intellectual framework whereby someone can then ascend into Christian faith, right? No one's going to be argued into Christian faith, but rather stories are, and the use of cultural stories, both positively and negatively as necessary, is in some ways how I think, the best rhetorical approach. So that's what Mockingbird does, in a nutshell. So now we're a theology and culture website, not exclusively pop culture, but yeah. So like every week, I will read 100 different publications and cull the best 10 articles. And we do a weekend roundup where we sort of cite 6 and through links to the other 4. But that's part of a stance toward culture, which is sort of, I mean, the kind of old biblical words would be in but not of. But I think to that is a sympathy to sort of listen to and point out what's good whenever we can, whenever and wherever we can.
What's your readership like around, how many people are using this website?
So the website has, we don't give out numbers, but yeah, I mean, we do actually. So well over 1 million people visit the website every year.
What's the name of the website?
Mockingbird, it's mbird.com.
Mbird.com.
Yeah. And the readership is kind of across the board age-wise. I mean, I look at the stats from Google Analytics, and it's pretty evenly distributed across all age ranges.
I'll give you an endorsement. I read your Valentine's Week
Oh yeah,
synopsis of last week,
yeah,
and it was fascinating. And the part you had on the nuns in the maximum security prison
yeah,
was precious.
yeah,
It was precious. I've been reading it for a while because Nate turned me on to it a couple months ago. The writers in the magazine and the writers online, they're phenomenal. They're so talented. It's like, as I said to you a minute ago, it's like reading the New Yorker magazine for wannabe Christians or people looking that are hungry. I think it's great. And I'm one of the old people. It's geared towards younger people.
yeah. The trouble is finding young writers. Actually, so I edit the website. So I edit articles. I also try to recruit writers, and young writers are always difficult, in part because they're still learning how to write. So
Thank you so much for sharing
Thank
all
you.
that you did with us this morning.
Thank you very much.
thank you for having me.